Hey guys, Bartell's Bookshelf here with my latest recent reads video. This is probably going to be kind of short because I've only read two books in the last couple weeks or whenever I made my last video. I figured it would be better to kind of get this out of the way now because I don't know how long it's going to take me to finish another book. I mean, I'm like kind of two-thirds through another one and, a few other things, but with how my reading habits have been lately, I don't know kind of how fast I'm going to read, and I prefer to make videos about things before I forget, everything that I've read. And the second book I don't even have with me because I had to lend it to a friend, but we'll get into that. But so I figured I would also use this to talk a little bit about the upcoming Holmes is Where the Heart Is event, so we'll get into that after I talk about my reads. But first off, I have Penance by Rick R. Reed. This copy's beat to shit, but... you can see. I bought this like 10 years ago off of Amazon for like $15. But this is from the Del Abyss horror series, which I've talked about a few times on this channel. Transgressive 90s era paperback horror, sort of created as a response to the 70s and 80s paperback boom, and to kind of do things that are a bit more transgressive, a bit different. Authors like Kathy Koja, Poppy Z. Bright, and stuff were first published under this line, so very, very, very influential, even if a lot of people don't know about it, which is sad. But I've been trying to collect and read all of them. There's about 40 or 50. I started this actually on around September because I wanted to read a horror book, and I was in the mood for some of the Del Abyss stuff because it tends to be a bit darker and more transgressive, and this turned out to be so like dark and upsetting that it like kind of took me a while to get through. I should say I don't normally give content warnings and stuff, but this book deals with a lot of really heavy dark things, including child essay and stuff like that. So if that's something that upsets you, there'll be another video at some point. You can watch that. So yeah, just letting you know. You can back out now. But anyway, so this book is about, it takes place in Chicago, and it follows a small group of sort of, teenage street hustlers, who are kind of, selling themselves to make ends meet and stuff like that. One of them is this boy named Jimmy. He's 14, 15, somewhere around there. Young teen. And he has a very horrible encounter with this incredibly disturbed man named Dwight. Basically, and he escapes and everything, and his wife, discovers him, doing these things to this young boy, and she leaves him, and because of that, Dwight has a breakdown. He was already very mentally unstable, but this is sort of the crack that sort of breaks him open, and he ends up going on a sort of vigilante spree, spurred on by the voice of his dead aunt, to basically kidnap these street hustlers, and purify them, make them give penance, for doing what they did to him, and he starts kidnapping people that Jimmy knows, Jimmy's friends and stuff, and it starts sort of affecting his life, and so he ends up teaming up with this other character who's a priest, named Richard, and the priest is also struggling with some of his own pedophilic tendencies. And so this sort of unlikely duo has to team up to take down this, horrible monster. As I say, as you can tell from that synopsis, this is a very, very heavy book. In fact, I was shocked when I started this, just how dark it went and how far it went. These are themes that people are afraid to explore now, still. And obviously, child essay and things like that. Pedophilia, all that sort of stuff, grooming. They're very, rightfully so, very controversial hot-button issues that, people have very strong feelings about. What surprised me about this was not only the fact that it wrote about these things with such sort of matter-of-factness and clarity and stuff, it's also very sympathetic. Not only towards, the street hustlers in the story, who are, living hard, they're there for various situations. Maybe they got kicked out of home, maybe they ran away, maybe they have drug problems, alcohol problems, but as I say, it's presented very matter-of-factly, and there's a lot of sympathy for them. And even for the priest character, because, he's sort of the opposite of Dwight in that, he has a lot of these same sort of urges, but he struggles with them, and he knows they're wrong. And in fact, in the beginning of the book, he's actually going to a sort of a sex addicts anonymous type thing to try and kind of control these urges. And it goes a lot in the story into how sort of he struggles with his faith. He struggles to reconcile his faith with these urges. Why would God make me in this way and stuff like that. And I want to be clear. I mean, this book does not shy away from anything, which is another thing that was really shocking about it. I mean, the stuff that happens in this book. I mean, like, I don't get disturbed very often. I'm not, I'm not one of those people who's like, oh yeah, disturbing, whatever. Like, but this really like was unnerving. Not only because of what was happening, but the fact that it was presented in such a matter of fact, I mean, they don't. As I say, he doesn't. The author doesn't shy away from anything, and I was really shocked by that. Pleasantly so, because I have said before, I do think there is value in being transgressive, and I do think there is value in exploring these darker sides of things, and I think there is something to be said for an author writing about these, depraved things that do happen in real life, and kind of shoving, grabbing your head and shoving your face in it and being like, here you go, like, this is the reality, this is what happens. And obviously, of course, this is exaggerated, Dwight is kind of a very, sort of your average kind of crazy person that you might see in sort of a thriller horror novel like this. But the fact that the things the urges that he's dealing with are so depraved, and the things that he's doing are so out there and horrible to, children, basically, I mean, makes it like doubly shocking, and I kind of have to respect the author for that. And also, one of the things I found really interesting about it was that he's exploring these things that a lot of people would sort of ignore. There's a lot of stuff in this book about how the hustlers can't go to the police and can't talk to family because they don't have family, their family won't listen to them, and what cop is going to listen to a street hustler, that type of thing, especially if they're young, and there's a lot of that sort of stuff about sort of the downtrodden and the people that we choose to ignore, and the people that get left behind. I mean, he goes heavy into all the backstories of every single one of Dwight's victims, and we learn a lot about them and where they came from and who they are and stuff and what they mean to the other characters. And it's surprisingly like deep and complex and sympathetic in a way that I thought was really, especially for the time period, astonishing. Especially because there's a lot of queer characters too. Rick Reed is a gay man, and nowadays he writes a lot of like gay romances and thrillers and stuff. But he got his start writing for Del Abyss. I have another one of his books called, what is it called? Hang on. I have another one of his books here called Obsessed that I assume, based on this, deals with a lot of similar themes. So I'm probably going to read that. In fact, I think this was his first book published through Del Abyss. So yeah. So yeah, this was a pleasant surprise. I was very. I mean, I don't want to say it wasn't a fun read, and as I mentioned, this took me a while to get through, partially because a lot of the things that it talks about are so unflinching and so upsetting that I had to kind of take breaks, and it took me until early January or end of December to finish this, and it was kind of disappointing in a way because. While the first half of it, I thought, did a really good job, as I say, delving into all these characters and these dark themes and stuff. By the back half of the novel, I kind of felt like we were spinning our wheels a little bit, kind of just, re-going over the same themes again and again and the same ideas and stuff, and we weren't really, there wasn't a lot of, like, forward momentum. He wasn't really finding a lot of new ways to explore some of these themes. And on top of that, Dwight is already a very kind of, as I say, a very stereotypical sort of crazy guy character that you might see in a book like this, like Red Dragon or, Silence of the Lambs type thing, not nearly as deep or complex as those, but it's very much in that kind of vein, the big outsized, crazy villain guy, psychopath, and I thought he kind of became a little bit so outsized and over the top that it became a little bit silly. And that was also around the time I started like getting through the book faster, because it sort of like broke the spell, I guess you'd say, it became less upsetting and more kind of just shocking for shocking's sake. Although, it didn't even really do much very shocking in the last half, like it just sort of became a very generic sort of serial killer thriller type book. It was really interesting for the pairing of the priest and Jimmy. And their relationship is really, really fascinating. And I wish that was kind of dealt with in a more satisfying way. It's kind of like put on the back burner towards the last half of the book, which makes sense because they're more focused on catching the killer and stuff. There's just a lot of really interesting ideas that I felt like weren't completely followed up on in a way that I found satisfying. And also the ending I thought was very, very rushed. I liked where it ended up. Like emotionally it made a lot of sense. And I think like if it had been like sort of fleshed out and developed properly, it would have really hit, but unfortunately it didn't. But at the end of the day, I mean, for the time, considering the time this was written, 1993, and the things that it talks about, and the way that it depicts those things, and the sympathy that it has for its characters and stuff, and Rick Reed, I was reading, was a newspaper reporter before, becoming a novelist, and it kind of has that air of like verisimilitude, especially as I say, in the first half. It feels very much sort of like a very detailed sort of investigative journalist kind of thing, And while it did end a little bit disappointingly, I am sort of, I don't want to say I'm glad I read it, but as I say, that there is value in reading these kinds of things, in exploring these darker sides of humanity that people kind of just want to ignore. And I think there's something to be said about writing a book like this, where these people who are normally sort of downtrodden and ignored and stuff are given a place to speak, and to not only speak but to fight back, and to be depicted with such like sympathy and stuff. So I thought that was really, really interesting. So yeah, I liked this enough that I definitely want to read Rick Reed's other book for Del Abyss, and it really just kind of solidifies like I think how special this line was, because I guarantee, as far as I know, like I've read a lot of horror novels, or I'm at least aware of a lot of horror novels from this whole time period, and I don't know of any that were writing about these kinds of things with such depth and sympathy, and empathy. So I think there is something to be said for that. So if you do decide to read this, obviously, your mileage may vary, and obviously be very, very, very careful about, trigger warnings and that kind of thing. This is not a happy book. This is not a fun book, but I think it's a valuable book, and I think there's something to be said for that. So yeah, that was Penance by Rick R. Reed. And as I say, the second book I don't have here because I had to lend it to a friend. But the second book I read was Tender is the Flesh by Agustina Bazterrica. I'm sorry, I probably mispronounced that. But this is a very, very famous book. Blew up all over the world in like 2020 when it got translated into English. This is an Argentinian novel. Again, very dark, very transgressive. I guess that just seems to be the flavor right now. Well, actually, I read this book for an upcoming book club with a few friends. So, but we all tend to like dark, transgressive stuff, don't we? I do. That's a big part of my brand, I think. But anyway, this is a very, very famous book. A few friends of mine wanted to read it for a book club, so I did. And yeah, it was really, really good. It was really interesting. This is a futuristic sort of sci-fi novel where in the future, humanity, what they call the transition has happened, where humanity has been infected with a virus that basically makes them incapable of eating animal meat. They get sick, they get viruses, they go crazy. It's completely like anathema. You can't touch any animal meat of any kind. And so this takes place in a society where a few years after that, all the animals have been exterminated, or huge swaths of them, and cannibalism has been legalized. And this follows a man named Marcos who works in a meat processing plant, processing special meat, as they call it, where, and now humans are now sort of grown in labs, and, it's very much treated like the old meat industry, but with humans. And there's all this sort of coded language around it. They call it special meat. They call the people that they're slaughtering, they call them head. They're using all these sort of euphemisms to sort of obfuscate the idea that, we're eating people. And it's seen as like very taboo to even like talk about head as if it's people and stuff like that. And there's all these like rules and regulations and things. And Marcos is basically in a very dark place. His wife has just left him after their child was stillborn. His father has kind of lost his mind, and his work is living in a nursing home, which is a big part of the reason why Marcos has kept his job in the meat processing plant, because one, he did it before the transition, so he's good at it, and two, it pays really, really well. Anything involving like the meat industry and stuff pays really, really well. So he needs the money to keep his dad in the nursing home and stuff like that. But it's about sort of his emotional sort of volatility and anger at kind of the world and what it's become, and all of his like thoughts and feelings and stuff. And yeah, this was a really, really interesting book. I wasn't really sure about it at first, just because I didn't really like know what to expect. It's written in this very sort of clinical, dispassionate style, which, fits the whole vibe of the story, where everyone's kind of like speaking in euphemisms and not really saying what they mean, and everything's kind of like, softened and stuff. And there's not really a plot as such. It's more just Marcos kind of wandering around, dealing with the people around him, kind of going about his life, reflecting on the world, what it was before and what it's become, and kind of showing us, the readers, as we follow him through this story, kind of what this world is like and how it operates, and and to kind of get us to think about all these things. Obviously you could read this as any number of sort of like critiques, on whether it's like capitalism, the meat industry, and it's very much in the vein of like those classic dystopias like 1984, where it's like one man who's kind of like internally kind of rebelling against the system, and it's a really really interesting world. Each chapter really is almost like a little short story where we kind of learn another aspect of how this world works. Sort of how the meat processing works, how they tan the skin, how butcher shops work, how they arrange the cuts of meat. They even talk about sort of different little trends and stuff, and like conspiracy theories and rumors and things. There's people who have this conspiracy theory that the government lied about the virus and is basically saying that so that we can eat people and like lower the population. There's stuff about these uber rich people who are able to basically hire head so that they can like hunt them and then eat them and stuff. All kinds of things like that, and it's really really interesting. It's one of those things where it's like I really kind of had to let it sit with me for a bit, because when the ending came around, and I don't want to go too much into spoilers, because I know this is a very popular book, and a big part of it is kind of where there's some stuff that happens that's very surprising, and I wasn't sure how I felt about it, but then I thought about it some more, and I like read some stuff online, and it kind of helped me realize kind of the what it was going for, and I think that with that in mind, I think the ending is very impactful and it's very shocking. It's just very eye-opening in the way that just in the way that we can willingly put the blinders over our eyes in order to sort of get what we want out of the world. The way that so many of us can just sort of face forward, doing our thing, sort of not making waves, but like inside you could be screaming and stuff like that. And there's a lot of that in Marcos, and a lot of stuff about sort of the way that people are so willing to accept the status quo that they basically just aren't even able to think for themselves. Like it talks a lot about Marcos's sister, who is kind of like all in with whatever the trend is, and she talks about stuff like she carries like umbrellas around outside because she's worried about like birds attacking and stuff, which is like a big like rumor that's been passing around, and so now it's become like a trend for everyone to have like parasols and stuff, things like that. It's not necessarily a book that I would read for something that's very like not emotionally involving, in the sense of like it's not necessarily about like the characters and the story and stuff like that. It's more about just the ideas and the way that it's written. Again, this is another book that has a lot of very upsetting themes and imagery. Obviously, if any of that sounds like upsetting to you, then tread carefully. But they go into some like really horrendous, especially with the way that the meat processing is described. Again, she doesn't shy away from anything. I mean, in terms of like just what they do to these people and these bodies, how they prepare them and everything, and what they do to them with all of these different industries and things, and the way that sort of rich people use their power to do all these depraved things with them, and just all kinds of things. And it's very very, as I say, very clinical, very dispassionate. It reminded me a little bit of that book Tender is the Flesh, in the way that the violence was written. Very clinical, very surgical, because in the minds of all these people, this is meat, this is just meat. It wasn't a living being, it wasn't a human, it wasn't, it's that whole thing of you don't really think about where your food comes from kind of thing, but this like shows you every step of the process, and it's very, very graphic and very unsettling in sort of the casualness of it, and I think there's a little bit of kind of that banality of evil to it as well, which was really, really interesting. So yeah, I think that was also a very, very interesting read. I didn't love it necessarily, but I enjoyed it. Enjoyed isn't the right word, but you know what I mean. Us horror fans, what we mean when we say we enjoyed something. We got something out of it. So yeah, I thought it was really interesting. I'll be very interested to talk about it with the book club when we meet up. We're supposed to be meeting up at the end of the month. So I would recommend that if you can stomach it, and if that sounds interesting. And then lastly, before I go, so I wanted to talk about the Holmes is Where the Heart Is event for 2026, which is in February, and we just read a bunch of Sherlock Holmes stuff. This particular event is in memory of Sean D. Standfast, who died recently. And, I didn't get much of a chance to, speak with him, but I commented on a couple of his videos, and we talked a little bit about Clifford D. Simak here and there, and it sounds like he was having a very hard time of it, and, and I hope he, I'm glad he's at rest, It's sad that we've lost him, but I think, it's very fitting to, dedicate this event to him. This event was also created by Jim at Mystery and Mayhem, and there's a bunch of co-hosts, which I'll link in the description. So yeah, we're just reading Sherlock Holmes stuff, and so that gave me the excuse to talk about and to get back to the complete Sherlock Holmes, complete novels and stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So, shocker, until this, I hadn't actually read any Sherlock Holmes. I mean, of course, I've seen the movies, the TV shows, I've seen all kinds of adaptations and things. I'd never actually read any of the stories, which I've always been it's one of my, literary blind spots that I've been very, ashamed of. But, last year, around September, I started this first volume, this Bantam edition of Sherlock Holmes, just because I like these mass market paperbacks. And I got about that far into volume 1, and then I got distracted by Halloween and other stuff. But this reading event is the perfect excuse to get back into it. So I figured I could just chat kind of briefly about the first 2 books in the collection, and a few of the short stories. I've read the first 2 novels and about 4 of the short stories so far. But yeah, I mean, these are great. I don't need to tell you. If you're any kind of mystery, literature fan or anything, you know Sherlock Holmes is great, right? I mean, what can I say that hasn't already been said? Holmes and Watson, one of the greatest detective duos probably ever. They were the blueprint for every modern detective story, pretty much. And the thing that I love about Sherlock Holmes, to be honest, I could care less about the mysteries, because there's some mystery readers who are all in on, the mystery itself. They're all about solving the puzzle of, putting all the pieces together, of figuring out what's happening and who did what and everything. They want to think like a detective. I'm not like that. I just care about character and atmosphere and story and things like that. And the characters of Holmes and Watson are what make these stories for me. I mean, it doesn't matter what they're doing, what they're investigating. They're just so much fun. Holmes is obviously, he's very hyper analytical, very sort of almost kind of autistic coded. I've heard some people sort of theorize about that. But he's very brusque. Kind of puts a lot of people off. Has a lot of strange ideas about things. But he's whip smart and he knows how to solve a mystery. And he boxes like hell. And by contrast, Watson is sort of the more straight laced, straight man, straight. Sort of foil to Holmes, and just their banter is so great. Even from the very first book, A Study in Scarlet. From the second they meet, the way their personalities mesh and clash, in equal measure, is just so much fun to read. And Holmes is such a fucking snarky little brat, and the way that Watson sort of is frustrated but also kind of pushes back against him. I mean, it's so much fun. Again, I don't need to tell you guys these. If you're any kind of mystery fan, but it's great to finally actually discover it for myself. And that's why, this is a big book, but before I got distracted by other things, I was blasting through it. I made it about 300 pages in, and this is 1,060 pages, something like that. So yeah, it's just so much fun, and just Doyle's evocation of Victorian London and just the atmosphere and everything, and the mysteries are interesting. Don't get me wrong. I really liked The Sign of the Four. That central mystery was really, really cool. A Scandal in Bohemia, obviously, for Irene Adler and everything. That's another great one. Irene Adler's so great. I was shocked to find out she's only in that one story. I thought she was a recurring character because you see that with all these kinds of adaptations. These characters show up all the time, but a lot of the big famous ones like Irene Adler and Moriarty, they only showed up in one story. So it's a little bit shocking, but it just goes to show how powerful and how far-reaching these stories are, that they've had such an effect that people have just remixed and rehashed and reinterpreted them in so many different ways. And one of the other things that surprised me was how ruthless Sherlock can be sometimes. In a Study in Scarlet, there's a scene where he needs to test out some poison, so he brings in this old dog who's basically already at death's door, and he basically poisons it to demonstrate how this poison works and how the efficacy of it and things. And just stuff like that's very shocking, and then you go back and you watch some adaptations the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes movie where, he's doing all these experiments on Gladstone and stuff, and you realize it's actually more faithful to the character than I thought. And that was something that I already knew kind of before I went into this. because when I was younger, I was very much like anti RDJ and all that stuff, and I hated that movie because it's not true to the characters. I never even read the book, so what would I know? And then I learned more about the actual characters and the stories, and now that I've actually like read a good chunk of it, it is surprising how faithful those movies are. Just not in terms of the tone and everything, but just the spirit of it, of the characters and everything, because like obviously the classic sort of Nigel Bruce era Watson is kind of depicted as like a bumbling idiot, but Watson in this is very much like Sherlock's equal. I mean, obviously he doesn't have the deductive powers and everything, but he's it's very much like a buddy cop kind of thing, like a Riggs and Murtaugh sort of situation, which I find a lot more interesting and satisfying than just kind of the bumbling partner. And obviously they're very gay, but we can save that for another time. But yeah, just I'm really glad I finally started reading these. These are so much fun. And I look forward to continuing with it again with Holmes is Where the Heart Is. Obviously, I'm not going to get through this whole book in February, but, I'm just going to kind of pick away at it and maybe make some update videos kind of talking about where I've been, what I've been reading, that kind of thing. This is one literary blind spot that I'm very, very happy to finally sort of fill in, because I'm really enjoying it, and I can see sort of the influence and the popularity and all of that, and it's just so great to finally be able to experience that for the first time at 34. I'm 34 this year, and it's like, how did it take me so long to get to this? But so yeah, that's Holmes is Where the Heart Is. I hope the rest of you join us for that if you're so inclined. And again, rest in peace, Sean Standfast. We'll miss you. And check out all the other co-hosts and everything. So yeah, that's about all I have for this one. Again, like I've been reading kind of slow lately, so I don't know when I'll be back. Depends on how quickly I finish some things, but I am in the middle of several books, so we'll just see what happens. But until then, I'll see you guys next time. Bye.